Sooner or later, every chess enthusiast and beginner faces the question of which openings can and should be played, and which ones should absolutely be avoided. And today, based on my own playing and 6 years of coaching experience, I'll share with you which openings should go straight onto your personal blacklist, because they are simply not suitable for amateurs. Let's get started right away. A good opening for amateurs meets the following criteria. First, it should be easy to understand. You should be able to easily grasp the plans you need to follow once the opening phase of the game is over. Second, for your opponent, there shouldn't be a huge number of variations you need to memorize because each variation will require different plans and different actions from your side. And third, of course, is how much time you'll need to study this variation. The less, the better. Be sure to watch this video until the end so you don't accidentally start playing and using an opening that doesn't suit you at all. And the first opening we'll add to your blacklist as white is... This will be the Catalan opening, which arises after the moves d4, d5, c4, e6, and f3, and f6, and white plays g3. Once the Catalan opening appears on the board, black has a huge range of options for how they can continue, and you need to be aware of all of them. Plus, this opening is very difficult to understand. It has various plans. You need to be ready to play for the initiative by sacrificing a pawn. You need to be prepared for a closed system from black, a solid one where they just set up securely. And then you have to build up pressure somewhere in the center, going for complications. Also, as I already mentioned, black can accept the sacrifice. And in the main lines, you won't get that pawn back quickly. And here they have various continuations for how to hold on to that pawn. They can play a 6 in order to play b5. They can play next 6 and after castling play rb8 and here go for b5. There are a lot of different options. They can also play c5 here, not trying to hold on to the pawn on c4 specifically, but instead immediately trying to undermine the pawn on d4. The Catalan opening is absolutely unsuitable for amateurs. You'll have to spend an enormous amount of time studying this opening, just hoping to remember something and grasp some of the plans. It would be better for white if you prefer to play d4 to play the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit with clear and reliable follow-up plans. For example, after we finish our development, we use the minority pawn advance on the queen's side in the Carlsbad structure, or we can at some point bring the knight to e5 and try to support it with the pawn on f4. With an attack on the king's side, this setup is called the Pillsbury Ring. Or, as another option, if you still prefer d4 and want a solid setup where you do not have to memorize anything, you can play the London system and set it up further. Knight to f3, pawn to e3, to c3, knight to d2, bishop to d3, and castle. This is the London system. I've covered it on my channel, and I should mention that, of course, closed openings are much more difficult for amateurs to master. But if you're a fan of such setups, then play either the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit or the London system. Don't play the Catalan opening. The next opening that absolutely all amateurs should avoid is the Ruy Lopez. Why? Again, because the Ruy Lopez is very difficult to understand. You don't have any simple plan for a direct attack on the king. It's a positional opening. It's important to know how to maneuver and understand where to place your pieces, where they're supposed to go. Also, black has a huge number of options for how they can play. They can play the Jenisch Gambit, they can go into the main lines of the Ruy Lopez, or they can go for the Berlin Endgame, which at one time was very popular because Vladimir Kramnik used it in his match against Kasparov. So, are you ready to play this endgame? Please tell me. And there is no reason why you have to study the Ruy Lopez specifically in this variation. It is very difficult to master. You will spend a huge amount of time on it. For amateurs and beginners, of course, the Italian game is a much better option. For example, after the move bishop to c5, you play the Evans Gambit, sacrificing a pawn in order to quickly seize the center. To already create a bunch of problems for your opponent, well, naturally, after the move d6, we go d4 to create a lot of problems for them. Or if they play their knight to f6, go knight to g5 and play the fried liver attack. Yes, and after d5 you can play knight takes f7 as one of the possible options. Of course, black has good continuations, but learning and mastering them will be much easier. You can play the Goring Gambit, go d4, d5, c3. This is playing for initiative, playing for a lead in development. If you're not a fan of sacrificing pawns, you can simply play the center game and just play Again, it's a simple plan. You need to castle long as quickly as possible and attack on the king side. This will also be much easier to learn than the Ruy Lopez. Now let's move on to playing as black. And I think you've already guessed which opening you should never play as black. Under no circumstances should you play it, especially for amateurs. That's the Sicilian defense, Najdorf variation. Of course, because there are a huge number of variations again. The opening is complicated and it's difficult to understand. By move 6, white already has at least almost 10 real branches they can choose from. And you need to be aware of all of them. This opening is very good for professionals, for top chess players who study it day and night. After all, this is a counter-attacking opening for black, and if you're not ready to spend so much time, you don't need to. It's for those who want to enjoy chess and get a good position out of the opening. Instead of the Najdorf variation, you have good alternatives. For example, if you play the Sicilian defense, after d4, you can play knight takes d4, and f6 and c3. The standard dragon variation. Play g6, put the bishop on g7, castle, and then develop the knight to c6. If you want a slightly more advanced option, you can play the accelerated dragon variation. Play g6 without playing d6. This will save you time, and then you can play d5 without losing a tempo in important lines. You can also, for example, play the Poulsen variation in the Sicilian defense, for instance. e6, d4, take, and then play a 6. Then you put the queen on c7, the knight on c6, and the bishop on b4. If white develops the knight to c3, this is also a very good line to learn, where you can play for the initiative. But there isn't a huge amount of theory you need to memorize, just simple plans, straightforward play, you apply them and enjoy the process. Speaking about the move e4 in general, what else can I recommend for aspiring amateurs? Of course, the classic French defense is also a very good and solid option to consider starting to play with. Why can't I recommend playing e5 in response to e4 for amateurs? The answer is very simple. If we play the Sicilian defense, the dragon variation, or if we play the French defense. A very important point is that we avoid a huge number of gambit lines from white which they can't use against us. Now think about what you would do if you play e5 in the Italian game. You'll be facing the Evans gambit, the fried liver attack, possibly the Goring gambit, and many other lines. If you're planning to play the Russian game, well, I think you understand, you need to study it. The move e5 is fine, but you need to have a clear idea of what you'll do against all the sharp lines from white. And you should be able to imagine what to do against the King's Gambit in similar openings. If you've answered all these questions and you know your way around these lines, then go ahead and play e5 with confidence. But still, the best options for amateurs, which you should start playing and get used to from the very beginning, are the Italian defense, the dragon or Poulsen variations, or the French defense after the move e6. Everything else is questionable. And now, let's figure out what chess amateurs should absolutely never do if they encounter the move d4. The Grünfeld defense is strictly off limits. Why? Don't let the word defense confuse you. This is a very aggressive opening where black gives up the center right from the start in order to undermine it later. With the move c5 and the hope of putting pressure, specifically pressure on that center, are you ready for that kind of game? Ask yourself that question. But I have to disappoint you. White won't always take the center. They might play calmer lines, for example, e3. They can play a quieter variation. Bishop to f4, knight to f3, lines where you always need to know how to proceed next. Moreover, even if white does go for the so-called center grab, at the moment after bishop g7, white already has a lot of options. Huge ones. How can they play? They can play knight to f3, they can play bishop to c4, bishop to e3, bishop to b5 with check, or queen to a4 with check. And in many of these situations, there are their own subtleties, and you need to be aware of what to do next. It's a very challenging opening to master. Instead of the Grünfeld defense against d4, if you prefer to play knight to ef6, take a look at the King's Indian defense. It's a setup that you can use essentially against most of white's options, and then continue with e5. You also give up the center, but then you play e5 and start undermining it with a further attack on the king side. If you're looking for something more aggressive, take a look at the Volga Gambit, where you sacrifice a pawn on the queen side right from the start, but after you finish your development, you'll have a straightforward play on the queen side with initiative, creating problems. For your opponent, well, dear friends, if after the move d4 you still prefer the standard d5 and white responds with c4, you should avoid the accepted queen's gambit. Under no circumstances should you take the pawn on c4. Why? Because you give up the center. And white has the option to calmly regain the pawn with e3, then capture with the bishop on c4. They can also play aggressively with e4, seize the center, and still win back the pawn. After that, you'll end up in a cramped position, and if you're not familiar with the theory, you might find yourself in an unpleasant situation. For example, after the moves e3, if you try to defend this pawn with b5, white will respond with a 4 and c6 to undermine it. Takes, and after the move queen to f3, congratulations, you're already suffering material losses. It's not worth accepting the pawn sacrifice on c4, because it's difficult to master all the various lines and there are just too many possibilities. Instead, play the strong universal Slav defense and set up this solid pawn triangle, after which you can unhurriedly continue your further development. I've also covered the Slav defense on my channel. You have a solid triangle and a clear, straightforward plan going forward. Of course, it's worth mentioning that besides the openings I have recommended, there are other openings you can safely use. They don't have such a huge amount of theory, and they're also good choices. In practice, choose and study, but try to avoid this group of 5 and under no circumstances use them. You'll have to spend an enormous amount of time and most likely you'll end up with far more problems than benefits from studying them. Well, if you still have any questions, friends, or if you want to dive deeper and study a particular opening variation in more detail, let me remind you that I am accepting applications for individual lessons. The link to my website is in the description. Just fill out the registration form and I will definitely get in touch with you. Let's move forward together. See you all again soon.